There is a white mansion in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that does not belong to the polite narrative of American progress. It sprawls across a hilltop like a temple built to impossible gods, constructed by people who had everything money could purchase except the one thing their fortune was supposed to guarantee: happiness. 60 rooms, 1,067 acres, and a sleeping veranda where, on a humid July night in 1932, a single gunshot ended not just a life, but an entire mythology. This is the story of the Reynolds family and their cursed palace called Reynolda. Not the sanitized tale you will find in tourist brochures or local heritage websites, but the deeper, stranger chronicle of how tobacco money built a utopia that became a prison, and how that prison claimed the life of the golden boy who was supposed to inherit an empire. If you value deep investigations into American wealth, the brutal mechanics of family dynasties, and the invisible architecture of power that shaped the 20th century, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now let us enter the house that tobacco built and examine the bloodstain on its eastern veranda. 1. The leaf that built an empire and poisoned its heirs. To understand the shot that rang out in 1932, we must begin with the crop that made it possible: tobacco. Specifically, the bright leaf tobacco of the North Carolina Piedmont, a plant that when dried, cut, rolled, and lit, became the most profitable agricultural product in American history. This is not hyperbole. By the early 20th century, tobacco was generating wealth at a scale that rivaled steel, oil, and railroads. And at the center of this golden hurricane sat one man, Richard Joshua Reynolds. Richard Joshua Reynolds was born on July 20, 1850, in Patrick County, Virginia, the son of a tobacco farmer who understood that the future belonged not to those who grew the leaf, but to those who manufactured the finished product. Young Richard absorbed this lesson. In 1874, at the age of 24, he moved south to Winston, North Carolina, a small town that would soon become synonymous with his name. He brought with him $3,000 in capital borrowed from his father and an ambition that bordered on religious fervor. What Reynolds understood, and what separated him from hundreds of failed tobacco entrepreneurs, was logistics. Most manufacturers of that era produced chewing tobacco, a product that required heavy, molasses-based flavoring and careful aging. Reynolds saw the inefficiency. He pivoted to smoking tobacco, which could be produced faster and cheaper. By 1879, his factory was producing over 150,000 pounds of tobacco annually. By 1885, that number had reached 2.5 million pounds. The acceleration was staggering, but the real transformation came with the cigarette. In 1913, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company introduced a brand that would reshape global consumer culture: Camel. The name was chosen for its exoticism, its hint of distant desert markets, and oriental mystery. The blend was revolutionary. Reynolds's chemists mixed bright leaf with Turkish tobacco, creating a smoke that was milder, smoother, and devastatingly addictive. Within 3 years, Camel controlled 40% of the American cigarette market. By 1920, that figure reached nearly 50%. The numbers defy easy comprehension. In 1912, the year before Camel's launch, Americans smoked approximately 15 billion cigarettes. By 1920, that number had exploded to 53 billion. By 1930, it was 120 billion. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was producing roughly half of those cigarettes. Every puff generated profit. Every pack sold added another brick to the fortune that would eventually crush the family under its weight. Richard Joshua Reynolds himself lived to see only the beginning of this exponential growth. He died on July 29, 1918, at the age of 68, from complications of pancreatic cancer. Ironic, perhaps, that the man who made his fortune from a product linked to cancer would die of the disease, though not the lung variant his cigarettes would later cause, in millions. At the time of his death, his personal fortune was estimated at approximately $30 million. Adjusted for inflation to 2024 values, this represents roughly $600 million. But this figure captures only his personal wealth, not the value of the company itself, which was worth exponentially more. The empire he built rested on three foundations. First, vertical integration. Reynolds controlled every stage of production, from purchasing leaf directly from farmers to operating his own distribution networks. Second, marketing genius. The Camel brand was everywhere: billboards, magazines, radio sponsorships. The company spent millions on advertising at a time when most businesses considered marketing an unnecessary expense. Third, labor exploitation. The factories in Winston-Salem employed thousands of workers, many of them black women and children, who worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that would today be classified as criminal. They earned pennies per hour, while Reynolds accumulated millions. This is the economic foundation upon which Reynolda was built. Not genius, not innovation alone, but the systematic extraction of value from labor and the monetization of addiction. Every white column of the mansion represented thousands of workers' hands stained with tobacco juice. Every imported Persian rug was purchased with profits from lungs that would blacken and collapse decades later. This is not moral judgment. This is accounting. Richard Joshua Reynolds left behind 4 children from his marriage to Catherine Smith: Richard Jr., Mary, Nancy, and Zachary Smith Reynolds, born November 5, 1911, the youngest son, the heir who would inherit the curse along with the fortune. 2. The woman who built a paradise that became a tomb. If Richard Joshua Reynolds was the architect of financial empire, Catherine Smith Reynolds was the architect of its physical manifestation. And here we encounter one of the central ironies of this story. The house that would become synonymous with tragedy was conceived as a monument to health, progress, and utopian living. Catherine Smith was born on February 11, 1880, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, into a family that was respectable but not wealthy. She was Richard's first cousin once removed, a detail that raised eyebrows even in the permissive social climate of the early 20th century South. She began working as his secretary in 1903. 2 years later, on February 27, 1905, they married. She was 25. He was 54. The age gap of nearly 30 years was not unusual for the era, but it established a dynamic that would define their relationship. Catherine was not a passive society wife. She was a partner, a manager, and eventually the true power behind the construction of Reynolda. Catherine looked at Winston-Salem in 1906 and saw a problem. The city was booming, fueled by tobacco money, but it was also choking on its own success. The air was thick with coal smoke from factories. Sewage ran in open ditches. Diseases like tuberculosis and typhoid were endemic. The wealthy could purchase many things, but they could not purchase clean air within city limits. Catherine's solution was not to reform the city. Her solution was to build a separate reality outside it. In 1906, she began acquiring land 4 miles northwest of Winston-Salem. She worked through agents to avoid driving up prices, purchasing plot by plot until she controlled 1,067 acres of rolling hills, forests, and farmland. This was not a country estate in the European sense. It was a planned community, a model for self-sufficient living. Catherine envisioned a place where the Reynolds family could live, surrounded by nature, supplied by their own farms, powered by their own electric plant, and insulated from the chaos of industrial capitalism that had made them rich. She hired Charles Barton Keene, a Philadelphia architect known for his arts and crafts sensibility. Her instructions were specific. She wanted a bungalow, not a mansion. But the bungalow she described would have 60 rooms. The main house alone was designed to contain 64,000 square feet of living space across 4 floors. To call this structure a bungalow was either radical modesty or spectacular delusion. Construction began in 1912 and continued for 5 years. The main house was completed in 1917 at a cost of approximately $500,000, equivalent to roughly $12 million today. But the house was only the centerpiece. The estate included a working dairy farm with a state-of-the-art pasteurization facility, a central power plant that generated electricity for the entire property, a post office, a blacksmith shop, stables, greenhouses covering more than 2 acres, a day-on-day 9-hole golf course, and a small village of cottages for the estate's 300 employees. Catherine insisted on the latest technology. The house had central heating, a central vacuum system with pipes running through the walls, an internal telephone network connecting every major room, and an aeolian pipe organ whose 2,500 pipes were embedded in the walls and ceilings so that music would seem to emanate from the structure itself. The organ cost approximately $20,000, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. It was played from a console in the main hall, and when the organist pressed the keys, the entire house vibrated with sound. The sleeping verandas deserve special attention. These were not enclosed bedrooms, but semi-open spaces with screens instead of windows, designed so that family members would sleep in fresh air year-round. This reflected the prevailing medical wisdom of the era, which held that tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases could be prevented or cured by constant exposure to fresh air. The Reynolds family, along with most of the American upper class, was terrified of tuberculosis. It killed indiscriminately. No amount of money provided immunity. So they built these open-air sleeping chambers, where even in winter, family members would sleep under piles of blankets with the wind and cold pouring through the screens. Catherine's vision extended beyond technology and hygiene. She believed in education and social uplift, at least within the paternalistic framework of her class and era. She built a school on the estate for the children of employees. She established a church. She insisted that the dairy workers follow strict sanitation protocols. She maintained meticulous records of every expense, every crop yield, every gallon of milk produced. Reynolda was not just a home, it was an experiment in benevolent control. But beneath this progressive veneer lay the fundamental contradictions of Southern wealth. The estate employed both white and black workers, but they lived in segregated housing and performed strictly separated roles. Black workers were relegated to manual labor, farmhands, cooks, laundresses. White workers held supervisory and skilled positions. The school Catherine built was for white children only. The church held segregated services. Reynolda was a progressive utopia only if you ignored the color line that ran through every structure, every policy, every interaction. Catherine Smith Reynolds moved into her completed mansion with her family in December 1917. She had spent more than a decade planning and building this paradise. She had 4 healthy children, including 7-year-old Zachary Smith, who was showing signs of his father's independent spirit and his mother's sharp intellect. She had achieved everything her ambition demanded. She had built a world where her family would be safe, healthy, and happy. She would live in that world for less than 7 years. On July 15, 1924, Catherine Smith Reynolds died during childbirth at the age of 44. She had remarried after Richard's death in 1918, wedding a man named James Webb, a former schoolteacher. The pregnancy was unexpected. The delivery went catastrophically wrong. Both Catherine and the infant died. In one afternoon, the architect of Reynolda was gone, and the utopia she had built was left without its guiding intelligence. Zachary Smith Reynolds was 12 years old when his mother died. He had already lost his father 6 years earlier. Now he was functionally an orphan, living in a palace designed to protect him from every danger except the one that would eventually kill him: loneliness. 3. The golden boy who wanted only to escape. Smith Reynolds, as he was known to everyone, grew up in a cage made of marble and privilege. This is not metaphor. This is the literal architecture of his childhood. 60 rooms, most of them empty. Corridors so long that footsteps echoed. Gardens so vast that you could walk for an hour without seeing another person. And everywhere, the crushing weight of expectation. By the terms of his father's will, Smith and his siblings inherited the fortune in trust. The will stipulated that each child would gain full control of their inheritance on their 21st birthday. Until that date, the money was managed by executors, primarily Smith's uncle, William Neal Reynolds, who had taken over operational control of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company after Richard's death. The amount waiting for Smith was approximately $20 million, equivalent to roughly $460 million in 2024 currency. This represented not just wealth, but power. The ability to do anything, go anywhere, become anyone. Except Smith did not want to become anyone. He wanted to disappear. From his earliest teenage years, Smith exhibited behavior that today would be recognized as depression and anxiety. He was shy, stammered when nervous, and avoided the social events that his family status demanded. He found the world of tobacco business suffocating. The endless board meetings, the conservative men in dark suits discussing profit margins and marketing strategies, the expectation that he would one day assume a leadership role in the company, all of it repelled him. What Smith loved was motion, speed, height. He became obsessed with aviation. In the 1920s, aviation was not yet a mature industry. It was still the domain of barnstormers, daredevils, and dreamers. Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight occurred in May 1927, when Smith was 15 years old. The event electrified the nation and made pilots into modern heroes. Smith seized on this mythology. Flying was the one arena where the Reynolds name meant nothing. In the cockpit, you were judged only by your skill and courage. Your fortune could not keep you aloft. Only your hands on the controls could do that. By the age of 16, Smith had earned his pilot's license. By 17, he owned his own plane, a Waco biplane that cost approximately $4,000, equivalent to roughly $70,000 today. He spent hours at the Winston-Salem airfield, practicing takeoffs and landings, pushing the aircraft to its limits. He was reckless but skilled. Other pilots respected him not because of his name, but because he could fly. In 1931, at the age of 19, Smith conceived a plan that represented both his greatest ambition and his deepest need for escape: a solo flight around the world. He would follow roughly the route that Lindbergh and other famous aviators had pioneered, flying west across the Pacific, through Asia, Europe, and back across the Atlantic. He spent months planning, studying maps, calculating fuel requirements, and preparing his aircraft. This was not a whim. This was a meticulously researched expedition. But the journey never happened. Because in the summer of 1931, Smith met Elizabeth Holman. 4. The siren from Broadway who shattered the Southern. Illusion Libby Holman was everything that Winston-Salem was not. She was born Elizabeth Lloyd Holzman on May 23, 1904, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a middle-class Jewish family. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, and possessed a voice that critics described as smoky, sultry, and dangerously seductive. She changed her name to Holman, moved to New York, and by the late 1920s had become one of Broadway's most successful performers. Her signature song was Moanin' Low, a blues number she performed in the 1929 revue, The Little Show. The performance was scandalous for its overt sexuality. Holman would drape herself across a piano, half singing and half moaning the lyrics, which told the story of a woman in love with a violent man. Audiences were mesmerized. Critics were appalled. Holman became famous. But her fame was inseparable from her notoriety. In an era when respectable women were expected to be chaste, demure, and deferential, Holman was none of these things. She smoked. She drank. Heavily. She had affairs with both men and women, including, according to persistent rumors, the actress Tallulah Bankhead and the writer Clifton Webb. She wore pants, used profanity, and refused to apologize for any of it. She was 30 years ahead of her time, and for that, conservative America despised her. Smith Reynolds saw her perform in New York in early 1931. He was 19 years old, painfully shy, and utterly unprepared for the force of personality that Holman represented. He was captivated. He attended multiple performances. He sent flowers backstage. He began to pursue her with the single-minded intensity that he had previously reserved for aviation. Holman initially dismissed him. To her, Smith was just another stage door admirer, a boy with too much money and too little sense. But Smith was persistent. He flew his plane to cities where she was touring. He waited for hours outside her dressing room. He offered her wealth, yes, but also something else. Genuine adoration. For Holman, who had spent years fighting for every role, every bit of recognition, the attention of a millionaire heir who asked nothing but to be near her must have been intoxicating. They began an affair in the summer of 1931. By November, they were married. The wedding took place on November 16, 1931, in Monroe, Michigan, far from Winston-Salem and the prying eyes of the Reynolds family. It was a hasty, almost furtive ceremony. The justice of the peace who performed the marriage later told reporters that the couple seemed nervous, distracted, and that Smith had been drinking. The bride wore a simple dress. There were no guests, no family, no celebration. Just two people making a decision that would destroy them both. When news of the marriage reached Winston-Salem, the reaction was immediate and vicious. The Reynolds family was horrified. William Neal Reynolds, Smith's uncle and the de facto head of the family, viewed Holman as a gold digger, a Jezebel who had seduced his naive nephew. Smith's sisters, Mary and Nancy, both respectable society matrons, refused to acknowledge Holman as family. The local newspapers, which normally treated the Reynolds family with fawning deference, began publishing barely disguised attacks on the new bride, questioning her background, her character, and her motives. But Smith was legally an adult, and there was nothing the family could do to annul the marriage. So they waited. They waited for the marriage to collapse under its own contradictions. They waited for Holman to reveal herself as the opportunist they believed her to be. And they made it clear that Libby Holman would never be accepted into Winston-Salem society. Holman and Smith returned to Reynolda in late November 1931. Imagine the scene. A Jewish Broadway performer, known for singing blues and wearing men's clothing, walking into the most conservative mansion in North Carolina, a house built as a monument to Christian propriety, where hymns were sung on Sunday. Mornings and alcohol was forbidden by law, though not by practice. The collision was inevitable. For a few months there was an uneasy truce. Smith was deeply in love, or at least deeply infatuated. Holman was trying in her own way to adapt. She attempted to play the role of Southern lady. She attended church services. She met with the estate staff, but she was fundamentally unsuited to the role. She was bored. Winston-Salem offered nothing that interested her. No theaters, no nightlife, no artistic community. She was trapped in paradise, and paradise felt like prison. By early 1932, the marriage was fracturing. Smith's jealousy became pathological. He began drinking heavily, consuming the illegal corn whiskey that was readily available despite prohibition. He accused Holman of infidelity, though whether these accusations had any basis in reality remains unclear. Holman, for her part, made no effort to hide her contempt for Smith's friends, his family, and his world. The fights became frequent, loud, and increasingly public. And then came the pregnancy. Sometime in early 1932, Holman discovered she was pregnant. She informed Smith. His reaction was not joy, but panic. A child meant permanence. It meant the end of his around-the-world flight plans. It meant being tied to Reynolda, to Winston-Salem, to a life he had been trying to escape since adolescence. The cage was closing. By July 1932, the situation had become unbearable. Smith was drinking almost daily. Holman was visibly pregnant and increasingly desperate. The house, so carefully designed to promote health and happiness, had become a pressure cooker. The walls, which had witnessed hymns and children's laughter, now absorbed screaming arguments and the sound of breaking glass. On the evening of July 5, 1932, Smith decided to throw a party. 5. The last party and the shot that ended everything. The party on July 5th was ostensibly a birthday celebration for Charles Hill, one of Smith's friends from the IC, Winston-Salem social set. But in reality, it was an excuse to drink, and drinking was what Smith needed. By 8 in the evening, guests had gathered on the terrace overlooking the lake. Tables were set, bottles appeared. Despite prohibition, which would not be repealed until December 1933, alcohol was never scarce at Reynolda. Corn whiskey, smuggled in from the Appalachian stills, was the drink of choice. It was potent, unrefined, and dangerous. Smith was already drunk when the guests arrived. Witnesses later described his behavior as erratic. He was alternately jovial and sullen, laughing one moment and staring into the darkness the next. Libby Holman was also drinking, though less heavily due to her pregnancy. She wore a striking dress and tried to maintain the facade of the gracious hostess, but the tension between her and Smith was palpable. The third figure in this toxic triangle was Albert Walker. Ab, as he was universally known, was 20 years old, the son of a local Presbyterian minister. He had been Smith's closest friend since childhood. They had learned to fly together. They had shared every adventure, every confidence. After Smith's marriage, Ab had been hired as his personal secretary, living at Reynolda and serving as a constant companion. But his relationship with Libby Holman had become disturbingly close. They spent hours together while Smith was occupied with estate business or flying. They shared private jokes. They disappeared for long walks. Was there a physical affair? We do not know. The evidence is circumstantial. But Smith believed there was, and belief can be more powerful than truth. The party continued into the night. The heat was oppressive. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of alcohol. Around midnight, most of the guests began to leave. By 12:30, only a handful remained: Smith, Libby, Ab Walker, and one or two others. Smith's mood had darkened. He was drinking whiskey directly from the bottle. At some point shortly after midnight, Smith and Libby went upstairs to the eastern veranda, where Smith had chosen to sleep. Witnesses disagree on whether Ab Walker accompanied them or remained downstairs. What is certain is that within minutes a shot was fired. The sound was not loud. A Mauser .32 caliber pistol produces a sharp crack, not a boom. In the vast open spaces of Reynolda, the sound dissipated quickly, swallowed by the night and the relentless chirping of cicadas. But inside the sleeping veranda, the effect was catastrophic. The bullet entered Smith's right temple at a slightly upward angle, passed through the brain, and lodged in the left side of the skull. He collapsed immediately. Blood poured from the entry wound, soaking the rug and his pajamas. He was unconscious, but alive. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Libby Holman began screaming. Ab Walker rushed to the veranda. And here, the story enters the realm of absolute strangeness. Instead of calling for help, immediately, instead of telephoning the hospital or the police, Holman and Walker made a decision that would forever taint their credibility. They decided to transport Smith to the hospital themselves. Why? No satisfactory explanation has ever been provided. Some speculate that they were too drunk to think clearly. Others suggest that they panicked, fearing that the scene would look like murder and wanting to remove Smith from the house before authorities arrived. Still others believe that they were attempting to cover up evidence, the position of the body, the location of the gun, perhaps even the presence of a third person. Whatever the reason, they lifted Smith's limp body, carried him down the stairs, through the main hall, and out to a car. They placed him in the back seat. Ab Walker drove. Libby sat in the back, cradling Smith's bleeding head. The car raced through the dark roads toward North Carolina Baptist Hospital, approximately 4 miles away. Blood dripped onto the upholstery. They arrived at the emergency entrance shortly before 2 in the morning. Doctors took Smith immediately into surgery, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had destroyed critical brain tissue. There was no realistic hope of recovery. Smith Reynolds lingered for several hours, unconscious, breathing but not responsive. At 5:25 a.m. on July 6, 1932, he was pronounced dead. He was 20 years old. In 3 months, he would have turned 21 and gained full control of his $20 million fortune. He died without a will. His estate, by North Carolina law, passed to his widow. Libby Holman, the woman the Reynolds family despised, now controlled one of the largest fortunes in the South. 6. The investigation that became a cover-up. The first law enforcement officer to arrive at Reynolda was Sheriff Transon Scott of Forsyth County. He arrived around 3 in the morning after receiving a call that there had been a shooting at the Reynolds estate. What he found was chaos: blood on the veranda floor, blood on the stairs, blood in the car, but no weapon. This absence is critical. If Smith Reynolds had shot himself, as Holman and Walker would later claim, the pistol should have been lying on the floor near his body, or perhaps fallen from his hand. But the Mauser was nowhere to be found. Sheriff Scott searched the veranda thoroughly. He found nothing. Several hours later, after sunrise, a deputy claimed to have found the pistol on the rug in the veranda, in plain sight. This discovery was immediately suspicious. Multiple people had walked through that room. Multiple officers had searched it. How had everyone missed a large steel pistol lying in the open? The implication was obvious. Someone had placed the weapon there after the initial search. Then there was the bullet trajectory. Dr. Fred Haynes, the physician who examined Smith's body, noted that the entry wound was at an awkward angle. If Smith had held the gun himself, he would have had to twist his wrist into an unnatural position to achieve that trajectory. It was not impossible, but it was strange. Suicides involving handguns typically show more direct trajectories, the barrel pressed against the temple, perpendicular or nearly so. This wound suggested the gun had been held at a distance and fired from a higher position. The coroner's inquest was held on July 8th, 2 days after the death. A jury of 6 local men listened to testimony from Libby Holman, Ab Walker, and several other witnesses. Holman's testimony was bizarre. She claimed to remember almost nothing about the night. She described a complete blank in her memory from approximately midnight until she found herself in the hospital. Shock-induced amnesia, her lawyer called it. The prosecution would later argue that this was convenient fabrication. Ab Walker's testimony was equally problematic. He claimed he was downstairs when the shot was fired. But other witnesses placed him upstairs near the veranda, moments before the shooting. He changed his story multiple times, each version slightly different from the last. He seemed terrified, and with good reason. If this was ruled a murder, he was a prime suspect. The coroner's jury delivered a verdict that satisfied no one. Death at the hands of a party or parties unknown. This was not a ruling of suicide. It was not a ruling of accident. It was an admission that the evidence was contradictory and that the truth could not be determined from the available facts. It left the door open for a criminal prosecution. and criminal prosecution is exactly what the local prosecutor, Carlisle Higgins, intended to pursue. Higgins was a political creature, ambitious and aware that a successful murder prosecution of Libby Holman would make him famous. He presented the case to a grand jury. On August 4, 1932, the grand jury returned indictments for first-degree murder against Elizabeth Holman Reynolds and Albert Walker. The trial was scheduled to begin in November. Newspapers across the country began preparing for what promised to be the scandal of the decade. Reporters descended on Winston-Salem. Photographers camped outside the courthouse. Libby Holman, now 5 months pregnant, became the most famous woman in America. She was portrayed in the press as everything from a cold-blooded killer to a tragic victim. The truth, as always, was more complex and less satisfying than either narrative. But the trial never happened. On October 15, 1932, William Neal Reynolds, acting on behalf of the Reynolds family, sent a letter to the district attorney. The letter stated that the family, after consulting with their attorneys and reviewing the evidence, had concluded that Smith's death was a suicide. The letter further stated that the family did not support the prosecution and requested that charges be dropped. This was unprecedented. The victim's family was essentially asking the state to stop pursuing justice for his death. But the move was strategically brilliant. William Reynolds understood that a public trial would be devastating for the family and the company. Defense attorneys would drag every sordid detail into the courtroom: the alcohol, the affairs, the dysfunction. The Reynolds name, carefully cultivated for decades, would be dragged through the mud. And for what? Even if Holman was convicted, she would be executed, making her a martyr and ensuring that the scandal remained in the public consciousness for years. Better to let it go. Better to rule it a suicide, absorb the loss, and move on. The company's reputation mattered more than the truth. Carlisle Higgins initially resisted. He believed he had a strong case. But without the family's support, a conviction became unlikely. North Carolina juries of the 1930s were deferential to wealthy families. If the Reynolds family themselves did not want a prosecution, a jury would be reluctant to convict. On November 15, 1932, Higgins announced that he was dropping all charges due to insufficient evidence. Libby Holman and Ab Walker were free. The public was outraged. Newspapers editorialized that justice had been bought. Critics pointed out that a poor black defendant accused of killing a wealthy white person would never have received such leniency. They were correct. The Reynolds family had used their wealth and influence to end the investigation. They had chosen institutional preservation over accountability. And Libby Holman, the supposed gold digger, walked away with $20 million. 7. The aftermath and the curse that would not die. On January 10, 1933, 6 months after her husband's death, Libby Holman gave birth to a son. She named him Christopher Smith Reynolds, after his father. The child was born premature, weighing less than 3 pounds. Doctors doubted he would survive. But Christopher clung to life, spending weeks in an incubator before finally stabilizing. His survival meant that the Reynolds fortune, instead of reverting to the family, now belonged to this fragile infant. Libby Holman was appointed guardian of her son's estate, which gave her effective control over the millions. The Reynolds family contested this arrangement, filing lawsuits to have her removed as guardian. They argued that she was an unfit mother, a probable murderer, and a morally corrupt woman who should not have access to the family fortune. The courts disagreed. In the absence of a criminal conviction, Holman's rights as widow and mother were legally unassailable. She took her son and left North Carolina forever. She moved to New York, then to Connecticut, purchasing an estate in the town of Stamford. She resumed her career intermittently, but never regained her former success. The scandal had made her radioactive. Theaters were reluctant to hire her. Audiences were divided between those who saw her as a tragic figure and those who believed she had gotten away with murder. Libby Holman's life after 1932 was marked by relentless tragedy. She had relationships with both men and women, including a long affair with the actor Montgomery Clift, but never remarried. She threw herself into civil rights activism, using her wealth to support the early NAACP and other progressive causes. She performed occasionally, usually in small venues or for charity. She drank heavily. She developed a reputation as a difficult, volatile personality, haunted by the past. In 1950, her son Christopher, now 17 years old, was climbing Mount Whitney in California when he fell to his death. The official ruling was accident, but rumors persisted that it was suicide, that the boy had been unable to escape the shadow of his father's death and his mother's notoriety. Libby was devastated. She had lost her husband under suspicious circumstances. Now she had lost her son. The Reynolds fortune, which had promised freedom, had delivered only death. She continued for 2 more decades, performing sporadically, supporting causes, drinking. On June 18, 1971, Libby Holman was found dead in the garage of her Connecticut estate. She had died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Her car's engine was running. The garage door was closed. The official ruling was suicide, though her family contested this, arguing that she had been experiencing memory lapses and might have entered the garage confused, forgetting that the engine was on. Suicide or accident, the result was the same. Libby Holman, who may or may not have killed her husband in 1932, died alone in a closed garage 39 years later. The curse of Reynolda had followed her to the end. Ab Walker, the third figure in the tragedy, disappeared from public life after the charges were dropped. He moved to the Midwest, changed his name, and according to some sources, received a substantial payout from the Reynolds family in exchange for his silence. He never spoke publicly about the events of July 6, 1932. He died in obscurity in the 1970s, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. William Neal Reynolds, the uncle who orchestrated the cover-up, continued to run R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company until his retirement. The company prospered throughout the 1930s and beyond. Camel cigarettes remained one of the best-selling brands in America for decades. The scandal of Smith's death faded from public memory, buried under layers of advertising and corporate public relations. The Reynolds name, which might have been permanently tarnished, survived intact. Reynolda itself became a strange kind of monument. After Smith's death, the estate was used sporadically by various family members, but no one wanted to live there permanently. The house was too large, too expensive to maintain, and too haunted by memory. In 1946, Smith's older brother, Richard Jr., deeded the main house and surrounding gardens to Wake Forest University, which used the property for offices, and later converted it into a museum of American art. Today, visitors can tour Reynolda House. They walk through the same rooms where Smith Reynolds grew up. They stand on the same terrace where the final party was held. They can even see the eastern veranda, though the sleeping porch has been enclosed and converted into a gallery space. The bloodstain is long gone, scrubbed away or covered by new flooring. The guides who lead tours speak of Catherine Smith Reynolds's progressive vision, the estate's architectural significance, and the art collection now housed within the walls. They mention Smith's death briefly, usually describing it as a family tragedy without elaboration. The house is beautiful, the gardens are immaculate, the art is world-class, and beneath it all, the rot remains. 8. The meaning of the bloodstain. What are we to make of this story? We could frame it as a murder mystery and spend endless hours debating whether Libby Holman pulled the trigger, whether Ab Walker was involved, whether Smith Reynolds killed himself in a moment of despair. These questions are unanswerable. The evidence was compromised from the beginning. The investigation was terminated before completion. The principals are all dead. But the mystery of who pulled the trigger is less interesting than the question of why the trigger needed to be pulled at all. And the answer to that question is embedded in the architecture of Reynolda itself. Catherine Smith Reynolds built her utopia with the best of intentions. She genuinely believed that wealth, properly managed, could create a better world. She believed in clean air, good food, education, and opportunity. She believed that by removing her family from the chaos of industrial capitalism, she could protect them from its worst effects. But she failed to understand a fundamental truth. You cannot build walls high enough to keep out human nature. Reynolda was designed to be a self-sufficient paradise, isolated from the corruption of the outside world. But that isolation became suffocation. Smith Reynolds grew up in a house where every detail was controlled, every moment planned, every expectation defined. He was the heir to millions, but he had no freedom. His path was predetermined: attend the right schools, join the family business, marry an appropriate woman, produce appropriate heirs. The mansion that was supposed to protect him became the cage that trapped him. When he met Libby Holman, he saw escape. She represented everything Reynolda was not: chaos, creativity, sexuality, danger. She was Broadway and jazz and freedom from expectations. Of course he was drawn to her. She was the sledgehammer he used to shatter the gilded cage. But Smith failed to understand that you cannot escape yourself. The damage was already done. The isolation, the pressure, the loneliness, all of it had carved channels in his psyche that no amount of rebellion could fill. Libby Holman was not innocent in this story, but neither was she simply a villain. She was a woman trying to survive in a world that gave her very limited options. As a Jew and a woman and an artist, she faced barriers that wealth alone could not overcome. Smith Reynolds offered her financial security at the cost of her autonomy. She took the deal. Can we blame her? She entered a house that despised her, married to a man who loved her but also needed her to be something she could never be: a docile Southern wife who would spend her days arranging flowers and planning dinner parties. The tragedy of July 6, 1932, was not the result of individual evil. It was the result of a system that created impossible expectations and then punished those who failed to meet them. Smith Reynolds was crushed by the weight of inherited wealth. Libby Holman was crushed by the boundaries of acceptable femininity. The Reynolds family was crushed by the need to preserve an image that had never been real. And the house? The house simply stood there, absorbing it all. Reynolda is a monument to a fundamental lie, the lie that money can purchase happiness, that walls can keep out sorrow. That privilege is the same as peace. Catherine Smith Reynolds built a paradise, but she built it on the profits of addiction and exploitation. She designed every detail to promote health, but she could not design away the fact that her wealth came from a product that destroyed lungs and shortened lives. That contradiction poisoned everything. The white columns and the green lawns and the perfectly trimmed hedges were always a facade. Behind them was the industrial smoke of Winston-Salem, the black workers who were paid pennies to manufacture cigarettes in conditions that would eventually kill many of them, and the millions of Americans who would die from the product that paid for every brick in that beautiful house. The bloodstain on the eastern veranda was not an aberration. It was the inevitable result of a system built on extraction and exploitation. This is not to diminish Smith Reynolds' suffering or to suggest that he deserved to die. He did not. He was a young man, troubled and confused, who made terrible choices, but who also never had a real chance to become anything other than what his family's wealth and his mother's ambitions had shaped him to be. His death was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that was written into the foundation of Reynolda the moment the first stone was laid. We look at houses like Reynolda, and we see beauty. We see history. We see the American dream made manifest in steel and stone. But if we look more carefully, if we examine the economic mechanisms that made such houses possible, if we follow the money back to its source, we see something else. we see the cost. Every mansion has a body count, even if the bodies are not always visible. 9. The legacy. Written in smoke. The Reynolds tobacco fortune did not disappear with Smith's death. It grew. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company continued to dominate the American cigarette market throughout the mid-20th century. Camel cigarettes were joined by other brands: Winston, Salem, Doral. The company diversified, acquiring food and beverage companies in the 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, R.J.R. Nabisco, as the company was then known, was one of the largest conglomerations in the world. But the reckoning was coming. Beginning in the 1950s, scientific studies began to conclusively link cigarette smoking to lung cancer, emphysema, and heart disease. The tobacco industry fought back with every tool at its disposal: public relations campaigns, purchase scientists, lobbying, and outright lies. Internal documents later revealed that tobacco executives had known about the health risks for decades, but had deliberately concealed the evidence to protect profits. In the 1990s, the lawsuits began. State governments sued tobacco companies to recover health care costs associated with smoking-related illnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. In 1998, the major tobacco companies, including R.J. Reynolds, agreed to a master settlement agreement that required them to pay $246 billion over 25 years to state governments and to accept restrictions on advertising. This was not justice. It was a negotiated surrender. No executive went to prison. The companies admitted no wrongdoing. They simply agreed to pay a fine that, while enormous, was manageable given their continued profitability. And the cigarettes continued to be manufactured, sold, and smoked. The death toll continued to rise. The Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, established with a portion of the fortune that Smith never lived to control, became one of the largest philanthropic organizations in North Carolina. It funds education, healthcare, environmental conservation, and social justice initiatives. The foundation has distributed hundreds of millions of dollars over the decades, supporting causes that Smith Reynolds himself might have supported had he lived. The irony is inescapable. Money that came from addiction and death is now used to promote health and life. Is this redemption? Or is it simply the final stage of money laundering, the process by which blood money becomes respectable through the alchemy of charity? The Reynolds family itself dispersed. The later generations moved away from tobacco, investing in other industries, pursuing other interests. The name Reynolds no longer carries the same weight it once did in Winston-Salem. The factories that once employed thousands have closed or downsized. The city has diversified its economy. But the history remains, embedded in the street names, the buildings, the university campuses that bear the Reynolds name. And Reynolda stands. It is beautiful, maintained to perfection, a museum now, housing a collection of American art that draws visitors from around the world. You can walk through the rooms and admire the furniture, the architectural details, the paintings. You can stand on the terrace and look out over the lake and imagine what it must have been like to live in such splendor. But if you stand quietly in the eastern gallery, where the sleeping veranda used to be, and if you listen carefully, you might hear something beneath the hum of the climate control and the murmur of other visitors. You might hear the echo of a shot fired 92 years ago. You might hear the sound of a young man falling. You might hear the crack that ended not just a life, but an entire mythology. Reynolda is a beautiful lie. It always was. And the most tragic part is that Catherine Smith Reynolds, who built it with such hope and such meticulous care, never lived to see how completely her dream would fail. She died believing that she had created a refuge. She never knew that she had built a trap. This is the story of Reynolda House and the Reynolds tobacco dynasty. Not the sanitized version, but the true one. A story of wealth that could not purchase happiness, of walls that could not keep out suffering, of a golden boy who had everything except the one thing that mattered, the freedom to become himself, and of a house that stands as a monument not to success, but to the fundamental impossibility of using money to escape the human condition. The cigarette smoke has long since cleared from those 60 rooms. The bloodstain has been scrubbed away. The scandal has faded into history. But the truth remains, waiting in the walls. Reynolda is not just a museum. It is a warning. Wealth does not equal safety. Privilege does not equal peace. And sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. If this deep investigation into the architecture of American wealth and the human cost of empire has given you something to think about, share it. Let others see behind the facade. Let them understand that history is not just about great men and beautiful buildings, but about the invisible hands that built them and the bodies buried in the foundation. We are all visitors in houses we did not build. The question is whether we have the courage to see them as they truly are. But the death of Smith Reynolds was not the end of the curse that haunted Reynolda. The $20 million changed hands, the house stood empty, and the newspapers moved on to new scandals. Yet the Reynolds dynasty, built on Virginia tobacco leaves and marketed with desert camels, still had lessons to teach about the corrosive power of enormous wealth. The Golden Boy's death was merely the loudest, most dramatic note in a symphony of family destruction that played across decades. What followed Smith's death reveals patterns darker and more complex than a simple murder mystery. The real question was never who pulled the trigger. The real question was why this family, with all its resources, could not save itself from eating its own children. 6. The fortune that poisoned everything it touched. Christopher Smith Reynolds, the infant born 6 months after his father's death, inherited not just money, but a psychological burden no child should carry. His mother, Libby Holman, the woman, suspected of killing his father, raised him in a world utterly unlike the sterile paradise of Reynolda. They moved to Greenwich Village, then to Connecticut estates, always surrounded by artists, musicians, and political radicals. Libby threw herself into causes: civil rights activism, folk music revival, progressive politics. She was trying to outrun the shadow of 1932. But shadows cast by $20 million are long. Christopher grew up knowing his origin story. He knew his mother was called a murderer. He knew his father died violently in a house now owned by strangers. By the time he reached adolescence, Christopher Reynolds had developed the same psychological fractures that destroyed Smith: depression, anxiety, the weight of impossible expectations. On July 7, 1950, 18 years and 1 day after his father's death, Christopher Reynolds climbed Mount Whitney in California with a friend. At the summit, 14,505 feet above sea level, he slipped or jumped. The official report called it an accident. Christopher was 21 years old, the same age Smith would have been when he gained control of his inheritance. The mathematical precision of this repetition is staggering. Father and son, both dead at 21, both leaving behind questions no investigation could answer. The fortune, once again, passed to the next generation, this time split between more distant relatives. But by now, the Reynolds money had acquired a reputation. People whispered about it the way sailors whisper about cursed ships. The wealth that built hospitals also built graves. The economic structure of inheritance itself demands examination here. Richard Joshua Reynolds, the original Titan, accumulated his fortune through shrewd business practices and exploitative labor relationships. Thousands of black workers in North Carolina tobacco fields earned pennies while Reynolds banked millions. This foundational inequality embedded itself in every dollar. When Smith inherited, he inherited not clean, capital, but the crystallized labor of people who would never set foot inside Reynolda's white walls. The money carried moral weight whether Smith acknowledged it or not. His mother, Catherine, tried to launder this legacy through her model farm and progressive architecture. But you cannot design your way out of structural sin. Christopher's death closed one chapter, but the Reynolds family tree had many branches, and each one bore similar fruit. Anne Cannon Reynolds, Smith's older sister, married into another tobacco fortune and watched her own children struggle with addiction and broken marriages. Richard Joshua Reynolds. Junior, Smith's older brother, became a reclusive figure, uncomfortable with the spotlight that came with the family name. The pattern repeated across generations, great wealth producing not happiness but profound disconnection from ordinary human experience. The transformation of Reynolda itself after Smith's death reveals how architecture absorbs history. For years, the Iaoji house stood nearly empty. Libby refused to return. The family, fractured and traumatized, could not agree on its use. In 1936, Smith's siblings finally made a decision that would have horrified their mother. They donated the estate to Wake Forest College, which later became Wake Forest University. The utopian family paradise became an educational institution. Students walked the same corridors where Smith had wandered drunk and desperate. They studied in rooms where servants once polished silver. The house, conceived as a monument to one woman's vision of domestic perfection, became public property. This transformation was not altruistic. It was economically necessary. The cost of maintaining Reynolda, the power plant, the farms, the hundreds of acres, exceeded what even the Reynolds fortune could comfortably sustain during the Depression. The gift to Wake Forest was also a tax strategy. But symbolically, it represented surrender. The family admitted that Catherine's dream was unsustainable. The model farm could not feed itself. The self-sufficient paradise required constant infusions of tobacco money to survive. When that support vanished, the illusion collapsed. 7. The hidden architecture of control and its consequences. Return with me now to the physical structure of Reynolda, because its design philosophy holds clues to understanding the family's psychological unraveling. Catherine Smith Reynolds hired Charles Barton Keene not just to build a house, but to engineer behavior. Every element of Reynolda's layout served a social purpose disguised as architectural choice. Consider the servants' quarters. They were connected to the main house via underground tunnels and concealed staircases. The idea was that workers could move through the estate without being seen by the family or guests. Food traveled from kitchen to dining room through a dumbwaiter system. Laundry appeared clean in closets as if by magic. The Reynolds family could live in pampered luxury, while remaining completely unconscious of the labor required to maintain that luxury. This was not accidental. This was designed invisibility. The house taught its wealthy occupants that the world simply produced what they needed without human cost. For Smith, growing up in this environment created a catastrophic disconnect from reality. He understood airplanes. He could dismantle an engine and rebuild it. But he had no concept of how food reached his plate or how his clothes became clean. More dangerously, he had no understanding of reciprocal human relationships. In Reynolda, his needs were always met instantly by people who had no choice but to comply. When he encountered Libby Holman, a woman who did not exist to serve him, Smith had no framework for understanding the relationship. He could buy her attention with money and gifts, but he could not buy her internal emotional life. This realization destroyed him. The sleeping porch where Smith died was theoretically the most exposed. Room in the house, open to air and elements. But even this exposure was carefully controlled. The screens kept out insects, but let in sound. Smith could hear the estate at night, distant conversations of workers finishing evening chores, the mechanical hum of the power plant, the lowing of cattle. but he remained separated. The architecture created an illusion of connection to nature while maintaining absolute class division. He could experience the aesthetic of rustic simplicity while remaining wrapped in millionaire comfort. The estate's layout also reveals the fundamental contradiction in Catherine's philosophy. She wanted a working farm that was also a leisure paradise, but actual farms are muddy, smelly, and unglamorous. Catherine's solution was to create what amounted to a theme park version of agriculture. The dairy barn was designed by architects and built with the same attention to aesthetic detail as the main house. The cows were beautiful specimens, their stalls cleaner than most human homes in Winston-Salem. The farm produced income, but that was never its real purpose. Its purpose was to allow the Reynolds family to feel connected to the land without actually experiencing the hardship of working it. This pretense had profound psychological effects. Smith grew up believing he understood labor and productivity because he saw the farm operating. But he had never planted tobacco in 100-degree heat. He had never stripped leaves until his hands bled. The knowledge he possessed was abstract, aesthetic. When he tried to relate to working-class people like Ab Walker, he thought they were equals because they were friends. But Ab worked for Smith. The salary created an unbridgeable gap that Smith, in his naivete, could not see. This blindness contributed directly to the triangle that formed between Smith, Libby, and Ab. Smith believed in a friendship that was actually an employment contract. The house also contained spaces whose purposes shifted based on who occupied them. The basement, designed as utility space, became a speakeasy. The sleeping porch, intended for healthful rest, became a murder scene. Architecture cannot determine human behavior. It can only shape the stage on which behavior occurs. Catherine Reynolds built a stage for a particular kind of play, the triumph of American progress and domestic virtue. Instead, tragedy and violence seized the stage and performed a completely different script. 8. The broader economics of tobacco empires and their human cost. To understand the Reynolds curse, we must zoom out from the individual tragedies and examine the entire economic system that produced the fortune. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company did not become a colossus by accident. It succeeded through a combination of aggressive marketing, vertical integration, and willingness to exploit every advantage the Jim Crow South offered. In the early 20th century, tobacco companies faced a problem. Cigarettes were considered vulgar, associated with immigrants and the urban poor. Respectable Americans smoked pipes or cigars. Women did not smoke at all. R.J. Reynolds solved this with one of the most successful marketing campaigns in American history, the Camel cigarette, launched in 1913. The choice of a camel as mascot was deliberate. It suggested exoticism, adventure, the mysterious East. The early advertisements featured the slogan, "I'd walk a mile for a camel." This was genius. It positioned smoking not as a vice, but as a reward worth seeking. The economic impact was staggering. By 1920, Camel cigarettes dominated the American market with more than 40% market share. The factory in Winston-Salem ran day and night, producing billions of cigarettes annually. The Reynolds Company's profits funded the entire city's growth. But this prosperity was built on three pillars of exploitation: the labor of black tobacco workers, the addiction of millions of customers, and eventually the deaths of those customers from lung cancer and other diseases. The workers who actually made the cigarettes earned subsistence wages. The factories were hot, dangerous, and filled with tobacco dust that caused respiratory illness. Workers had no unions to protect them. North Carolina was a right-to-work state, hostile to organized labor. The Reynolds family could afford to build Reynolda precisely because they paid their workers as little as legally possible. When Catherine Reynolds created her model farm with modern equipment and fair wages for her estate workers, she was inadvertently creating a damning contrast. Her farm workers lived better than the people who made her wealth possible. But this contradiction never seemed to register. The estate and the factory existed in separate moral universes, connected only by the flow of money from one to the other. The cigarettes themselves, of course, were deadly. In the 1920s and 1930s, this was not yet widely known, though doctors were beginning to notice patterns. By the 1950s, the evidence was undeniable. Smoking caused cancer, heart disease, and premature death. Yet tobacco companies, including R.J. Reynolds, spent decades denying these facts, funding misleading research, and fighting regulation. The Reynolds family fortune, which funded museums and universities and medical research through charitable foundations, was simultaneously funding the deaths of millions of smokers. This creates a moral paradox that has no clean resolution. The money that endowed scholarships for poor students came from the same source as the carcinogens that killed their parents. Smith Reynolds's inheritance, the $20 million that possibly motivated his murder, represented not just abstract wealth but specific human suffering converted into capital. Every dollar he spent had a cost someone else paid, often with their health or life. Modern descendants of the Reynolds family have largely distanced themselves from tobacco. Many have become philanthropists, supporting causes directly opposed to smoking. But the fortune still exists. It still compounds in investment accounts. It still funds lives of extraordinary privilege. The original sin cannot be undone, only acknowledged or ignored. 9. The psychological prison of inherited wealth. Smith Reynolds was not murdered by Libby Holman or Ab Walker. He was murdered by the structure of inherited wealth itself. This requires unpacking. When you inherit vast sums of money at a young age, you face a unique existential crisis. Nothing you achieve is truly yours. Every success is tainted by the question of whether you earned it or simply bought it. Every relationship is poisoned by the suspicion that people want your money, not you. You cannot trust your own judgment because you have never faced real consequences for failure. The safety net of wealth catches you before you hit ground. This sounds like a pleasant problem to have. It is not. It is a psychological cage whose bars are invisible, but unbreakable. Smith Reynolds knew he had done nothing to earn his fortune. He was born to it. His father built the empire. Smith merely inherited the kingdom. This knowledge gnawed at him. His obsession with aviation was an attempt to find something he could do independently. Flying was dangerous, technical, demanding. It required skill that money alone could not buy. In the cockpit, Smith was briefly free of his name and his inheritance. The sky did not care about tobacco money. But when he landed, the Reynolds name was waiting for him. The trust structure that governed Smith's inheritance made everything worse. He could access his money, but he did not control it. Trustees, appointed by his father before his death, made decisions about investments and large expenditures. This arrangement was intended to protect the fortune from a young man's impulsive decisions. In practice, it created a nightmare of infantilization. Smith was simultaneously one of the richest men in America and powerless over his own wealth. He could buy anything he wanted, but could not change the fundamental terms of his life. Compare this to people who build their own fortunes. They may be ruthless, they may be exploitative, but they possess the psychological satisfaction of achievement. Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller. These men knew they had built something. Their children, by contrast, often struggled with depression, addiction, and aimlessness. The second generation inherits not just money, but a vacuum where purpose should be. Libby Holman recognized this vulnerability in Smith and, consciously or not, exploited it. She offered him what appeared to be authentic love, something that existed independently of his money. But the relationship was fundamentally transactional. Libby gained access to wealth and security. Smith gained the illusion of being loved for himself. When that illusion cracked, when he began to suspect her infidelity, when the pregnancy trapped them both. Smith had nothing to fall back on. His identity depended on being desired by this woman who represented escape from his suffocating world. When that desire evaporated, so did his reason to continue living. The pregnancy itself was catastrophic for Smith's psychology. A child meant the end of any possibility of escape. It meant he would replicate his father's life, tying himself to a woman he did not fully understand, raising children in Reynolda, managing the tobacco fortune, and eventually dying and passing the curse to the next generation. Smith saw his future with terrible clarity, and it looked like a prison. Death was not irrational in this context. Death was the only exit from a life that had been entirely predetermined before he was old enough to choose differently. 10. What happened to the others? The rest of the Reynolds saga, Libby Holman's life after Smith's death, deserves deeper examination because it illustrates what happens when you win a fortune. Through tragedy. She took her son Christopher and moved away from North Carolina, but she could never escape the reputation of being the woman who killed the golden boy. Broadway did not welcome her back. Her voice, once celebrated, now carried associations with death and scandal. She performed occasionally but never regained her former prominence. Instead, Libby transformed herself into a political activist and patron of the arts. She funded civil rights organizations at a time when such support was socially dangerous for a white woman. She became close friends with black intellectuals and musicians, hosting integrated gatherings at her Connecticut estate. This was not simply guilt-driven philanthropy. Libby had always been an outsider, Jewish in a Christian world, bohemian in a conservative culture, bisexual in a heteronormative society. She identified with other outsiders and used her fortune to support them. But the money corroded her life just as surely as it had corroded Smith's. Her son Christopher, raised in radical Bohemia rather than Southern aristocracy, still could not escape the family curse. His death on Mount Whitney destroyed Libby. She spent the last 2 decades of her life increasingly isolated, drinking heavily, cycling through relationships that never lasted. When she died by carbon monoxide poisoning in 1971, the official verdict was suicide, though some suspected accident. Either way, it was a quiet ending to a spectacularly loud life. Ab Walker, the third figure in the triangle, vanished almost completely from public record after the charges were dropped. Rumors placed him in New York, then California. Some accounts suggest he received a cash payment from the Reynolds family in exchange for his silence and permanent departure. He died in obscurity. His perspective on that night in July 1932 died with him. The Reynolds siblings who survived Smith fared little better. Richard Joshua Reynolds, Jr., the older brother who should have inherited the empire, was deeply introverted and uncomfortable with public attention. He fulfilled his obligations to the family company, but seemed to find no joy in the wealth that surrounded him. He married, had children, but remained a remote figure. His life was not tragic in the dramatic sense, but it was empty at the core. The money provided comfort, but not meaning. Nancy Reynolds, one of Smith's sisters, became involved in politics and philanthropy. She donated vast sums to conservative causes and Republican candidates, but she also carried the scars of growing up in Reynolda. Multiple divorces, estrangement from children, and the sense that despite all her resources, she could not build the stable family life her mother had dreamed of creating. The pattern holds across the entire extended family. The Reynolds fortune enabled lives of material comfort, but seemed to prevent genuine happiness. Why? Because money at this scale creates a barrier between the individual and reality. Problems get solved by writing checks, which means you never develop resilience or coping skills. Relationships become transactional. People around you want something. You grow suspicious, isolated. The fortune meant to provide security becomes a prison wall. 11. Reynolda today, what the house remembers. In 1965, Wake Forest University sold Reynolda House to a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving it as a museum of American art. Today, visitors can tour the restored mansion, walk the gardens, and learn about the Reynolds family through carefully curated exhibits. The house looks much as it did in Catherine's time, gleaming wood, Art Deco fixtures, and period furniture. But the violence and dysfunction have been tastefully edited out. The sleeping porch where Smith died is now just another room on the tour. The guide may mention that Smith Reynolds passed away there, but the details are softened. No blood on the rug, no empty whiskey bottles. The room has been returned to its idealized function as a place of healthful rest. The story has been domesticated, made safe for school field trips. This sanitization is standard practice for historic house museums. Nobody wants to dwell on the ugliness. The Tourism Board prefers to emphasize Catherine's progressive vision, the architectural innovations, and the art collection. Reynolda gets marketed as a celebration of early 20th century ambition and creativity. The darker truths hide in footnotes and academic articles that most visitors never read. But the house itself remembers. Buildings absorb the emotional energy of the events that occur within them. Whether you believe in literal hauntings or simply the psychological weight of history, Reynolda feels heavy. The corridors are too long. The rooms echo strangely. Visitors report feeling watched, uncomfortable, eager to leave certain spaces. The sleeping porch, especially, has an atmosphere that the cheerful docents cannot quite dispel. The surrounding estate, once a model farm, is now divided. Part of it remains with the museum. Other sections were sold off for development long ago. Where workers' cottages once stood, there are now suburban homes. The dairy barn operates as an upscale shopping village with boutiques and restaurants. The transformation is complete. The site of the Reynolds family's utopian experiment has been converted into exactly the kind of commercial space Catherine wanted to escape. Capitalism always wins. The most telling detail is what happened to the Reynolds family's relationship with Reynolda after they donated it. They stayed away. Despite maintaining offices and charitable foundations in Winston-Salem, the family members rarely visit the house. Some have never been back. The place represents failure, death, and the impossibility of escaping history. They prefer to keep their distance. 12. The unanswered questions that gnaw at history. The official story says Smith Reynolds committed suicide in a moment of drunken despair. The evidence contradicts this at almost every level, yet no trial occurred, no jury weighed the facts, and no verdict was rendered. We are left with fragments: the vanishing gun, the implausible bullet trajectory, the witnesses who got confused or suffered convenient amnesia. The most plausible reconstruction of that night runs something like this. Smith and Libby fought. The argument was about the pregnancy, about Ab Walker, about Smith's planned flight to escape. Smith had the Mauser pistol. He may have threatened suicide, which he had done before. At some point the gun discharged. Whether Smith pulled the trigger himself, whether Libby grabbed the gun and it fired accidentally, whether Ab intervened and the struggle produced the fatal shot, these details dissolved into alcohol and chaos. What we know with certainty is that the aftermath was coordinated chaos. The decision to move the body, the missing weapon, the destroyed evidence. These were not the acts of drunken panic. These were deliberate attempts to control the narrative. And they succeeded. The Reynolds family's wealth bought silence. The prosecutor backed down. The case closed. This injustice, more than the death itself, represents the real curse of the Reynolds fortune. Money does not simply buy luxury, it buys the ability to rewrite reality. The family decided Smith's death would be suicide, and so it was. The actual facts became irrelevant. The power to impose your version of events on the world is the ultimate privilege of vast wealth. and it is profoundly corrosive to any society that pretends to operate under rule of law. Every detail that does not fit the official story is a small tear in the fabric of justice. The gun that appeared where it should not have been. The ballistics report that raised questions nobody wanted to answer. The witnesses who lived the rest of their lives comfortably, financially secure, never speaking publicly about what they saw. These are not mysteries. These are consequences of a system where enough money can make truth optional. Modern forensic analysis would likely solve the mystery if the physical evidence still existed. But crucial items were lost or destroyed decades ago. The bullet, the gun, Smith's clothing, all gone. Whether this was mere incompetence or deliberate destruction is itself a question we cannot answer. The Reynolds family had the resources to preserve everything or to ensure it vanished. They chose the latter. The story of Smith Reynolds and Reynolda is not fundamentally about a single death. It is about the structural violence of concentrated wealth. The tobacco fortune that built the White Mansion was extracted from the labor of thousands of exploited workers and the eventual deaths of millions of customers. That fortune then destroyed the family it was supposed to sustain. Smith died at 21. Christopher died at 21. Libby ended her own life. The house became a museum, a mausoleum for a dead dream. Catherine Smith Reynolds built Reynolda to be a paradise. She believed that with enough money and enough planning, she could create a perfect world insulated from the chaos outside. She failed because perfection is not achievable through architecture and capital alone. The house's beauty could not prevent the ugliness of human nature from manifesting inside it. The fortune could not buy Smith emotional stability or teach him how to love without fear. The walls could not keep out jealousy, rage, or despair. We look at Reynolda today and see Art Deco elegance. We should also see a warning